All right, everybody, we are back again for another episode of The Coach's Compass. Now, remember, I still don't know what episode it is. I'm still just recording, bringing on cool guests from all across the world. Now, hit that like, subscribe, comment button down below so you can continue to have this thing grow and continue to bring on cool guests from all over the world. Now, I've got an OG, one of our very first members, one of the ones that came on season 1. Now we're already on season 5. We got Coach Ryan McWilliams out of Bo Jackson Elite Sports Performance. Coach, thank you and welcome back to the Coach's Compass.
Yeah, man. Excited to be on here, man.
So tell me, man, what's been going on, bro?
Man, a lot. Just impacting our community. We just built the BSF pitch performance into our Columbus, Ohio, Bo Jackson's Elite Sports Dome. So we
Let's
hired.
go.
Yeah, it's been pretty exciting, man. Helping out the entire, Midwest area, impacting athletes all over. We hired a strength and conditioning director and along with a pitching director. I can't remember if when we were first doing this together, I can't remember if we licensed and franchised it into our Bensonville Bo Jackson's Elite Sports Dome. But so we got 3 total locations, that I'm overseeing all the 3 pitching performances. Our headquarters is obviously growing, bringing on more performance coaches and internships. And like I said, man, impacting, athletes from 12 years old all the way to professional ball.
Man, nonstop growing. You gotta love it, baby. Like it's just going along. I'm proud of you, man. But it's been a year since we've talked. What do you think you've done the best in impacting the community of sports performance and also pitching?
Yeah, I think I would say probably the most important thing is educating not only the athletes but the parents, understanding how to balance multi-sport versus specialization athletes, teaching kids how to map out their year. Probably one of our biggest testimonies was Jack Bauer, who hit 103 miles an hour. He's the hardest throwing left-handed pitcher in America in high school ball, and now he's at Mississippi State. And it really came down for him, teaching him how to map out his year, deload, shutdown time, return to throw, programming, balancing out the weight room, little things like that is definitely been, our biggest success. Again, just educating the public and the athletes.
What does it mean to take a guy to 103 being the fastest left-handed pitcher in America at the high school level? Like, what does that equate to if you take other sports like a 40 of running a 4.3 or a 4.2 or like any other sport? What would that equate to like in baseball world?
I mean, I would say it's a very unique number to hit at that age. Obviously, there's a lot of genetic potential involved with that. So again, when you identify an athlete, like he joined us 2.5 years ago, 88, 92. So you could at 15 just turning 16, so you could already equate that to you identify a kid that has genetic potential. How do you keep him healthy so he can reach his genetic potential? And so again, that's the biggest contributor to this is the education part.
How hard was it though for a kid like that? You get him into 89, 92, like anywhere in that range, to get him to over the 2.5, 3 year span, to get him to 103. What was it like to kind of get him to understand that he's capable of doing that and repeatedly doing it over and over again? Like, how was the process of building him up, not only because he has great genetics, but like just building up his arm strength and teaching him how to get to that point?
Yeah, I think it just came down to teaching him how to map out his year, helping him, being a support system for him. I know he had other people and other coaches in his corner. I know he was represented by Boris with Matt White. So again, just having a support system in his back pocket, to lean on, keeping him, healthy throughout the year, pitch count, prioritizing the weight room, controlling the variables that are hard to control outside of the facility training and stuff like that. So it really just came down to communication as well, to really help an athlete like that, especially when you identify, genetic potential.
Is he one of those athletes that only played baseball, or did he play multiple sports, or like how did he do with, because a lot of these kids want to early on specialize, and then you got some kids that say that they're just, we've got kids at the middle school level that are telling us that they're just pitchers already at an early age. So how was it for him?
Yeah, so I mean, I believe when he was younger, multi-sport, freshman year in high school, I think he played football, but then I think he started sophomore year, he started to get into the specialization, side of things, because he realized, okay, I have a legitimate shot at moving on to the next level, being an impact player and a high valuable arm. And so once he took that step in specialization, doesn't mean we need to keep throwing all year round. It came to the science and the education part of teaching him how to map out his year.
So now you're opening up 3 locations, right? You've got 3 underneath your belt now. What's that process been like with also building connections with athletes, right? Wanting to be in like kind of, it's tough. You know what I mean? You go from one location to the next and you've got like certain area that you're working with one athlete, another area you're working with another. Like you might be needed in one more than the other. How's it been to balance it all out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to surrounding yourself with people who are going to continue to challenge you, yourself with the science and the education, being in a growth environment, growth mindset with that. Like I said, we hired, 2 guys to run our location in the Columbus through the Bodome, found great candidates, and so we truly believe that, it's not going to work, if you don't have, great people underneath you. So, obviously, like I stay in my attached location in our headquarters at the Lockport facility. And obviously, with collaboration with our other locations, Zoom, team meetings, phone calls, things like that, keep it on top of things. We have our own BSF app since I know the last time we talked, we didn't have that. So now that we have our own app, it's a lot easier to, control the variables and just getting the guys that we hire inclined to how we implement our system, how to manage volume, things like that. We never want to, neglect a guy. So, little things like that, plays such a huge dividend. So there's definitely an onboarding process with that, setting expectations, and finding someone that's going to build a great culture that we have, in Lockport. You got to try and mimic that. And so that's always the hardest challenge to this. It's not the training, it's personnel, it's controlling the culture and the environment. So, we found great guys to do just that.
That's awesome. And that's a lot of moving parts within just a year. Like literally we're talking about just a year that now you guys have an app where you're talking about hiring on more coaches to run the place that you're not at all the time. How is it though to kind of trust guys to do stuff when you're not watching? You know what I mean? Like I think that's the hardest part of being in your shoes, coaching other coaches, but also running a place. Sometimes you got to take your own break, right? Like sometimes you just want to trust the guy that you got. And like, how has that trust been?
I always like to say, like, you do the right things for the right reasons, everything will take care for itself. So that's why we had an onboarding process. We had, hiring processes, trying to get an understanding like who this guy is, what's his background. Specifically at our Columbus location, we hired for the director of pitching, Joey Romans. He used to be a pitching coach at Miami, Ohio. He was involved in the private sector. I believe he was with PRP in Indiana. So had a really good background, understood the role and the expectations that it takes to not only develop the culture, but to handle athletes in that private sector. So it really just comes down to building a personal relationship, not just doing, interviews and stuff on Zoom and just letting them have free reign. Like, we brought him in-house to get to meet him face to face. And we truly believed he was a great fit. Again, like little things like that. That's why like KPIs, key performance indicators, we're always constantly keeping up with each other, staying on top. How can I help? How can he help? Challenging each other, and always being in, like I said, in that growth mindset of how we can continue to get better. I believe that if you can control those variables, the rest will take care for itself. And again, like with training, there's a lot of different methods and systems in place, but the system that we put in place allowed the coach or the director to be their own individual. Obviously, if he's going to be working with guys at that location specifically and more hands-on, he's got a better pulse as to what that athlete needs through our system. So having the structure and having the system in place, having their own individual thoughts through our, even our assessment process. So when we first launched in Columbus, I went out there with our director of social media, Aaron Hubbard. He's 19. He built his own little Hubbard Media consultant, a social media company that he, helps build the commercials and things like that, helps on the social media side, does a fantastic job. I brought him with me to Columbus. And so how we kickstarted was built, we started off with like a metric camp. I set the expectation out there as to how it's, supposed to be ran. And so, again, like even onboarding athletes in metric testing, right? You're setting the expectations, you're making them aware of, what their strengths, but what their weaknesses are. How do we attack it through our system? So little things like that, when you're controlling those variables, it's really important, especially with the success that we had in Lockport. So now it's just more about how do we mimic that? And just like I said, making sure we have the right personnel.
Yeah, you talk about mimicking it and like kind of redoing, kind of recreating what you've already done. But if you look back at over this past year and even further years past, would you want to be coached by yourself now? And
Absolutely.
what did you take out that you no longer do anymore?
Yeah, I mean, when I was growing up and stuff like that, like I would always try and get a lot of different opinions and inputs, and I found out that was a harder way to mold my own reality of what I truly needed, right? And so it just comes down to building, even with the athletes, relationships with them, and a lot of it's a trust factor too, right? And so, again, like yeah, obviously, like when I was growing up, I wish I had something like this, but you can't change the past, so now you can only impact the future, and so we're going to keep doing just that, and I'm still learning. I'm pursuing to become a muscle system specialist practitioner with Greg Mack. He has a lot of PTs and chiropractors, orthopedic surgeons. He's helped, teach a little bit, for medical staff for Major League Baseball. And so again, it's not only, I'm not saying I have all the answers. It's even with my personal self, being in that growth mindset. How do I continue to challenge myself, grow and learn, and then put the systems in place to keep impacting the community.
Love it, man. Continuing to learn. But you talk about also bringing on coaches, new coaches in, maybe coaches that have maybe been at the private or the college or the pro level. Now you're bringing them into the private sector. What are you kind of trying to teach these younger coaches or coaches coming over to the private sector? And what do you think has been kind of the hardest part for them to kind of understand when they first get into this coaching side of the world, to the do's and don'ts?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think like what you know is what you know, and what you know is already limited. So it's just trying to challenge what they know, right? And to get them a better broad and more perspective on the education and the knowledge side of things. It's also just teaching interpersonal relationship, communication skills with athletes, like understanding the guy's maturity level, their skill set. What does the guy need more and what does he don't need more? And so really like when we do bring on coaches, like the biggest thing that I emphasize is the onboarding process with assessments. We just hired a full-time remote performance coach. He's in the East Coast out in North Carolina. We flew him in, we set the expectations. So, again, you know, I would love to find other guys, that are willing to learn. Again, if you're getting a candidate that thinks he has the answer to everything, then you want to make sure you challenge that. But again, like we want to surround ourselves with people that are open to learning more. And so again, if I'm invested in pursuing to be a certified practitioner and things like that, I'm sure there's information and knowledge that they haven't been inclined to know and not aware of. And so my obligation or role is to put the systems in place with what I'm learning and to make sure that I'm relaying that information properly, little things like that too. So, again, like when you're bringing on other coaches, you just want to make sure, again, like you're always continuing to educate them and you want to challenge each other too. Hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? If I'm always just saying, no, we got to do this, we got to do that, you don't want to be in a robotic system. You want to continue to challenge, what you've already put in place. And if you have guys that are willing to do that, or come up with different ideas, make something of their own, that's how you really build a great culture, not only just with your athletes, but, with your coaches too.
Yeah, onboarding performance coaches, strength and conditioning coaches into the space that you guys are in, how has that been to kind of mold the two together? Because I think there's always been that negative connotation behind, strength and conditioning coaches and, the specialization coaches and performance coaches and then even athletic trainers when it comes to just all sports. Right. But we're talking about very specific in the baseball world, right, where everybody's trying to avoid certain things because they think it's going to hurt their shoulder, it's going to hurt their arm power, like they're not going to be able to, like all these different things. Right. So how has it been for you guys to kind of bring it all together and find coaches that kind of follow the same suit? Because I think that's also another hard part in this industry is I guess there's a lot of egos, right? So how are we meshing together?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would say like specifically on the weight room side, when you're looking at adaptations, meaning how do you create the physical change for the athlete? It comes down to like, the throwing and the weight room side, you got to create adaptations to begin with to make the changes for the athlete. So one of the things that we put in place with our BSF app is a plus and minus system. And this is going to teach athletes what to do the days before and the days after they throw, live or bullpens on not only the throwing side, but the weight room side. So again, every system that we put in place is based on what the questions that the athletes ask us. So when we were operating on Google Sheets, it's a lot harder to obviously manage or at least to construct a full week layout of hey, this is what you're going to do 2 or 3 days before you throw a live or a bullpen, what to do the days after. So now on the app, so like your minus days are your days before. So for example, if an athlete's throwing live or a bullpen on Wednesday, that's your day 0, Monday's -2, Tuesday's -1, Wednesday's day 0, Thursday's +1, and then Friday you bring it back to -5 to build back up. So what's that going to do? It's going to incentivize the athletes to build those communication skills with the coaches as well. Hey, when do you think I'm going to be throwing next? Things like that. But again, like that's always the challenge with the weight room and the throwing is blending the two, right? Because why we put that in place is because like athletes would be like, hey, my mechanics are off, my velo's down. Why is that? I'd be like, okay, well, let's just not look at the day of what you did. Let's look at the 2 or 3 days before. I did a heavy output day. Okay, well, your CNS is shot, that day of. So we want to make sure, like with the weight room and the throwing side, we're balancing neuro fatigue, central nervous system fatigue, or that plays the same role, but even muscular fatigue as well. So that comprehensive approach, it turned on a lot of college, coaches to try and partner with us, for teams. So we just brought on Moraine Valley, they're a JUCO in our area. And so now we're handling all 20 POs, not only with the throwing, but, with the weight room side, having their off-season plan. They'll go on more remote with the app on their in-season. They can construct on their own. Each individual can move those plus and minus days around. And so, it also takes less work off of the coaches. Obviously, every coach at the higher level are incentivized to win. And not every, coaching staff wants to focus on player development, which is why they bring in, the private sector. And that's why you're seeing a lot of MLB organizations hiring guys in the private sector, because guys like us have a really good pulse on individual athletes, building systems in place. Things like that. So, again, like it just plays a huge role, with how you balance, the weight room throwing out.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to learn on the baseball side of things, but just also on the private sector of how they can mesh together with everything. But even as yourself, like you continue on to grow in your industry, what do you consider for yourself success? Besides PRs, wins, opening another gym and all that stuff, like what do you consider success for yourself?
I would say success for myself is knowing that I'm impacting not only the athletes, but the parents and the educational world. I mean, you're seeing injury rates higher than it ever has before. The game of baseball is placing a bigger demand on younger athletes than ever has before. And so for me, success is not only seeing athletes develop better awareness and education, staying healthy, but also moving on to the next level to be impact players. I mean, even the game of baseball now at the college level is it's more competitive than it ever has before. So for the high school athletes that are listening out there, you're not just competing against guys locally or even throughout the entire country. Like you're competing against college guys that are in the transfer portal that have legitimate innings underneath their belt. So how are you going to separate yourself? And so if we could do a better job at that, that to me, that's success. And again, like impacting the community, making people more aware of, how to balance, everything from a multi-sport to a specialization. But building that educational system to me is success. And like I said, you do the right things for the right reasons, everything else will take care for itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's a crazy world out there now for all sports on this transfer portal thing and how high school athletes navigate, get to the higher levels, even for those college athletes, how they move on to play the professional level. But even as a coach, right, there is an expiration date on all of us, right? There is got to be a point that, coaching comes to an end. Have you thought about, your exit plan or what is next if when coaching is over?
I'm only 25, so obviously I got a lot of time to think about that. I mean, again, like obviously to put myself in a position where, as I do get older, I obviously want to make sure for my personal self, I don't get burnt out. So again, it's going to come down to onboarding, building coaches underneath you, teaching them, educating them. I think the more that you do that, again, they're able to take on more responsibilities. But again, if you just bring on robots to just follow certain things or whatever, like, then it does become harder to manage them because you don't want total free reign. You want to have control on that in a sense. So for me, it's more about, okay, like if I want to have an exit strategy in the next, 30, 35 years, whatever that might be, it really just comes down to surrounding yourself with the right people and the people that are willing to grow and learn and understand, how to be successful, with a certain thing that you build. Right. And so, again, I don't really typically have thought about an exit strategy plan right now. Like my goal is to keep, impacting athletes, the community, and even coaches that do come on with us. And that's why we are starting an internship process. We built a great relationship with a sports scientist guy at a university called St. Xavier. And, a lot of his students are also baseball guys. And so, they either want to start their own thing or be a part of a private sector or even move on to the coaching world, with the team settings, even just developing plans and systems like that in place, that could also really help me, in a sense of making sure I have the right people on the training floor, touching up on every athlete of, making sure we're hands-on, we're working with them, we're helping impact them, little things like that. So, again, it just really just depends. I mean, like I said, I don't really have an exit strategy plan right now.
You're young, baby. Keep enjoying it while you can. I mean, enjoy the youth. When's the last time, because you talked about it a little bit, like avoiding the burnout. When's the last time you completely unplugged? Like you got away from working, you weren't on the phone, like you just got away from and got to live life a little bit.
I would say the 4th of July weekend, went out to New Buffalo, Michigan with my girlfriend, just little things like that. That's important too, making sure, that you do take time for yourself, as a coach out there. Again, we're in the service industry, right? And so sometimes when you're serving others a lot and you're not taking care of yourself, it can become a burden. It's a lot on you, right? And so I use my Sundays too as a day to give rest, big church goer. So making sure I reset myself mentally. But every day I have my own little personal routine. I call it my routine 5 and 5. I want to make sure I take care of my personal self first and then go serve others. So, but that comes down to, first thing in the morning, making your bed, cold shower, personal hygiene, reading a mental book, like a mental performance book. And then, out loud, I'll do my daily prayer. And then I'll say my 5, 5 things I'm grateful for, 5 affirmations. You say it out loud, you personally start to believe that. And now, right there, you took care of yourself, you took some personal time, and then you go serve others. So it just comes down to, I think, having structure and having daily routines. And that routine right there really changed my life as to how I viewed life, of what I really truly wanted for myself. Obviously I'm very passionate. Baseball's life for me. And so, again, like if I can take care of myself first day to day and then go serve others, I know I'm doing myself a due diligence with that as well. And obviously like our hours are different, like our fall and winter, like we don't start till later in the day. So like I got all my morning, to do my planning, to do my programming, to hop on calls. I do my afternoon lift and then boom, we serve our younger athletes, high school and younger, during those, 3 to 8 hours in the fall and winter. Yeah, like we'll have some in the off season, we'll have professional and college guys rolling in at 12:31. So, again, when that time starts coming, I got to get up a little earlier, take care of myself, take care of the things that I need to get done, and then go serve those higher level athletes that might need that individualized attention, to also impact their careers and lives too. Because you don't know who you're going to run into when they're an athlete. And sometimes the best coaches do make your athletes. And so you got to keep that long-term mindset, in line too. So again, like that just comes down to your personal routines.
I love it. Yeah, you got to have a routine. You got to have a structure of the organization of your plan, right, and your daily schedule, right. Otherwise, you will end up in a burnout, and you will end up putting out more time that you actually don't need to be doing things where you could have it planned out. But before we get out of here, Coach, what's one thing you would want us to ask our next guest?
Good question. How do they take care of themselves personally to avoid the burnout? Like if you're going to be in a role to bring on other coaches and stuff, what's your system in place to make sure that doesn't happen, to make sure that they're happy, doing what they do and doing what they love. Sometimes people get sidetracked, they start something that they love, business and personnel, and you talk about egos and just a lot of that other stuff gets in the way, and you kind of lose sight as to why you started something in the first place. So, what's your purpose, right? So always going back to that question. So that would be probably my next question that I would ask them.
What is your purpose? And Coach, do you feel like you found your purpose?
100%. It was my calling, dude. Like I felt like I had like the spiritual, like overcoming thing that, I started everything in my college dorm room first as a remote academy. And then we talked about before, like I landed a partnership deal to build this out in the Bo Jackson's Elite Sports Dome. And like I said, none of it was promised to get into the other 2 locations. I had to execute with the assets that I had and the people in my office that are great, that are, a supportive team. And, I did just that. And again, like, it's definitely my calling as a impact in the community and being a part of a big brand that is really, really well respected in the industry.
And I love it, Coach. And that's it for the day. Coach, I want to say thank you for coming back, right, for episode number 2, right, and seeing what you're doing and watching your progress throughout this all. Taking a kid from 92 to 103, and he's also a lefty, like that's pretty impressive. So I can't wait to see what he does down there at Mississippi State, and also to all your other athletes out there. Can't wait to see everything that they continue to do and how you do on the business side of things. So, Coach, thank you for coming back to the Coach's Compass.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me on, and definitely good to catch up.